Hi friends, welcome to a super easy holiday card tutorial. Today we're going to be painting some snowberries in watercolor with only 6 colors and 2 brushes. I'll even show you how to create a deckled edge so that your holiday cards have a nice natural country feel to them. Be sure to check out the links below for other video tutorials that might be perfect for your holiday season. Let's begin. I highly recommend preparing your paper before you begin your painting. I'm working on 140-pound cold press paper, which has a nice texture to it and a really beautiful pulpy feel. You can use any format you want, from a 4x6 card to a 5x7, or even experiment working with a square format card. In this case, I'm using an existing card, and it just gives me a better idea to visualize what kind of border and what kind of format or scale I'm working with here. Rather than using an X-Acto knife or a pair of scissors, I'm using a tear method just by lining up my ruler and tearing very softly along the edge to maintain that rough deckled edge. If you'd like something even rougher looking, then simply fold your paper, create a really strong crease. You can fold in both directions, and this will make your tear a little bit easier, and just tear by hand. And voila, you've got a paper that has a nice organic deckled edge. You're also going to want to decide whether you want a vertical or a horizontal format, and then you're going to want to fold your card in half, give yourself a nice generous crease for the spine, unfold it and tape it down in your desired format. In this case, I'm going to be doing a vertical format card, and my painting is going to be on the right-hand side of this panel. You're going to want to adhere your paper to a firm surface, preferably something non-porous. A table, a drafting table, a piece of plexiglass, or masonite does the trick. Now, I have accommodated for about a 1/2-inch border all the way around my card, so that won't interfere with my painting at all. And I want to decide whether I'm going to be painting right up to the tape and giving myself a nice clean edge and border, or if I want to have a rougher edge and paint well within the taped border and have more of a vignette style card. In this case, I'm not painting any kind of background. The illustration is just going to be floating in the center, so I'm not too concerned about how much space the tape is taking up. The last thing I like to do is just press down the tape and ensure that it has bonded to the surface really well so it doesn't lift or curl during the painting process. Let's finish off by placing a piece of tape on the opposite side of the panel that we're working on, just to remind us not to go over that side. To paint this card, you're going to need a little bit of paper towel or a rag for blotting your brush. I like having an extra little strip of the same watercolor paper that I use for the painting itself. Most of my painting is going to be done with this single brush. This is my designer blend. It's number 10. It's a pointed round, so it comes to a good point, and it's like having 3 brushes in one, so I can save myself a lot of time with it. I might need something a little bit smaller, so I'll have my number 1 sable blend as well on standby. You can certainly be using synthetic brushes, whatever is available to you. This is going to be super easy. The colors we're going to be using today will be Hooker's Green Dark as our dark bluish green, and sap green. I'm going to want a little bit of raw sienna, burnt umber, violet. In this case, I'm using dioxazine violet, and finally a little bit of ultramarine. They have dried up in my palette, so I'm just going to give those a little spray to wake them back up. In this demonstration, I'm going to be showing you how to mix all of your color right on the surface. So you will not need an extra palette for mixing space. If you want to create custom colors, you certainly can. But I think the joy and the beauty of this card is the fact that we can just mix and learn a little bit about speeding up the painting process by just mixing directly on the paper surface. The first thing I want to do is sketch out my image In this case, we're doing some beautiful snowberries, which are white berries, and I think will give a really pretty and delicate look to the card. I like using an H pencil for my sketching. It's just dark enough that I can see what I'm doing, but it's not so dark that the lead itself is greasy. Make sure it's nice and sharp, and then just have a gentle eraser, kind of like this kneadable eraser, on standby if you make any mistakes. So this will be a vertical format card, and of course, when open, the image is going to be on the right-hand side. So in this case, I'm going to just give myself a little bit of a guide. So I'm lightly sketching. I'm going to sketch a little bit darker for your benefit so you can see the actual spine of and the curve of the stem itself. The next thing I'm going to do is sketch out my berry shapes, and we can erase any lines that we don't want afterwards. So I'm just going to be starting with a series of overlapping circles, and once I've got these placed and the clusters are complete, I will erase out any overlapping lines. I find it easier to sketch this way instead of trying to draw the most perfect circle ever. I'm just creating these quick little spinny elliptical shapes. And the thing about snowberries is that they really grow quite prolific on one tiny little branch. I think it's very pretty when they overlap, so be sure that each berry isn't just touching the other. You do want to have some overlapping. So that is exactly what I've got right here and right now. So I'm going to now just erase out any extra lines. So where I've got the branch accidentally passing through, I want to erase that. And where I've got any overlapping ellipticals, I want to erase that as well. We can have the stem in front of some berries, which I think would be a nice touch. I'm actually just going to erase that one completely out. And of course, we'll be painting on some leaves as well. I think I'd like to have the stem in front of a berry on this side. Just design-wise, be mindful that the stem isn't passing right through the middle of a berry. Put it to the left or the right. So I will continue on just erasing out any lines that I don't want. I think in this case, I'm going to put this berry in front and this berry in front. So put that one there, this one here, this one here. So again, these are quite dark, but I'm just sketching them dark for your benefit. The next thing I'm going to do is create some really softly shaped spade leaves. And with the snowberries, they have just a little bit of a rounded tip. They shouldn't come to too much of a point. So I'm going to pass one leaf in behind. And we want to have the larger leaves at the bottom because they're more mature. And then they become increasingly smaller as we move towards the top. I think that feels about right. Just going to make this one a little smaller. If you're not comfortable with freehand sketching, you can consult the description below this video and get a hold of my traceable image, which will be downloadable. You can print it out and give it a trace if that's a little easier for you. I'm not going to worry about where the little button stems are on these berries. I'm just going to play with that once the time comes for painting. That's it for now. If you've managed to keep a light touch to your pencil, perfect. There's nothing more you need to do. If you've drawn your image and it's a little heavy-handed, you can take your kneadable eraser, roll it into a little snake, and then just simply roll it over the surface, and this will really quickly and very evenly lift up your eraser. We're going to want a little bit of water, so make sure you've got some clean water available to you. And I like to place it near my paper towel and my test strip. I also like having a piece of tissue or Kleenex on standby just in case I need to do an emergency blotting or use the tissue as a way to create some special effects. So have that handy. I like working light to dark and the wet into wet layers first. So I'm just going to be starting with some water and I'm going to pre-wet the berries. By doing so, we create this nice little skin on the watercolor paper, and that keeps the paint from penetrating a little too quickly. And the paint will just float on top really beautifully and stay wet into wet, and that will give us a little bit more time to paint. Now, if you've over wet certain areas or you wet outside of the lines, just blot really hard with tissue. So the first thing I'm going to do is just work with a little bit of raw sienna on my brush. So I'll go into my pools of paint here. This is raw sienna. If you don't have raw sienna, you could use yellow ochre. And I want this to be really pale, so I test it on my test strip, and I can even add water just to this baby little test strip. Wherever I anticipate the stems to be, that's where I'm going to put a little bit of this raw sienna. So I'm just starting by dropping in this color. And I don't want to put it in the center of every single berry. I want them to be all pointing in different directions. And in fact, I think I'll give a little bit of color to that berry, even though the stem won't be obvious. So you can let that air dry, or if you're feeling comfortable and everything is still wet, you can move on to the next color, which will be just dropping in the tiniest, palest amount of ultramarine blue. So you can see how I'm really using this test strip almost as an extra palette, just by grabbing a little bit of watered down ultramarine blue. And I'm going to go around the contour of the berry, which will give it a little bit more volume and a feeling of it being rounded and 3D. If you're finding that your berries are still a little too wet and the paint's spreading too much, you can give it a little bit more time to dry. I love using ultramarine blue and raw sienna to convey whites. I think oftentimes people use grays or blacks or even browns to show shadow on white subjects, but I use this combination even for like beautiful white lilies or white peonies, white roses. They just work together so beautifully. The warmth of the ultramarine and the warmth of the raw sienna work together and almost create a really pretty gray as they mix on the surface of the paper. Because they're both quite warm and there's a reddish tone to them, they don't turn green the way a typical blue and yellow would. So I'd love to just jump right into painting the leaves right now, but we do have to dry this up. Otherwise, the leaf color will bleed into the berries. So you could be patient and let that air dry, or we can speed it up by just using a hairdryer, which is my preference. This also keeps your paper from drying in a molded buckle if it is starting to warp or buckle. So for the leaves, I'm going to start with a little bit of sap green, and we're going to do this in one stroke. And we're going to do this in one stroke. So I want to see what's on my brush. That's a little bit strong, so I'm just going to dilute it inside the belly of the brush. I'm going to stand by with a little bit of tissue. And I'm just working on dry. I'm I'm using the natural point of the brush to create a beautiful shape here. I can probably do 2 at a time, but before they dry, I do want to introduce other colors. So I'm just cutting around and applying a nice even coat here. So before that dries, I'm going to bring in a little bit of the Hooker's Green Dark. I'm just going to float that in, and it's quite pretty. You can see that it is a cooler green, has a little bit more blue to it. To increase that blue, make it feel a little bit more vintagey, I'm going to bring in some ultramarine. The red quality of the ultramarine really grays down and sort of dulls the vibrancy of the greens, which is good. It makes it a little bit more natural looking. If you want it even more natural than this, you could add a little bit of burnt umber as well. I think I will do that. So I'm just going to drop in the burnt umber, just let that float. You don't have to be using the same colors on every single leaf. You can create a little bit of spontaneity and make it a little bit more natural by switching the colors up as you go along. On the smaller leaf, I'll start with that sap green just on dry paper. And actually I have enough on my test strip here to do another one. Once we get to the smaller leaves, you can do this in one stroke. So I'm just going to use the natural shape of the brush, push down, lift up. Start with a light pressure, heavy pressure, pull up, light pressure, heavy pressure to thicken up the line and pull up. Now I've done quite a number of leaves here all in one go, so I want to work quickly to get the color in before these dry. Spread that around. If your large brush does not come to a good point, you can switch to a smaller brush at any time. I think just to switch things up a little bit, I'm going to add a little bit of raw sienna to some of the finer leaves. I want to take good care to cut around the berries properly for any leaves that are in behind. So see how I'm just using my test strip as a little palette? When you're not working with overly complicated colors and you don't have a lot of colors to choose from, this is a really nice and efficient way to work. So I think I'll just increase a little bit of the ultramarine blue here. And you can choose how you want your colors to play out. You don't have to copy exactly what I'm doing. This just gives you a starting point. Now, before these dry completely, currently these leaves are almost all the same value. I want to change that up. I want to blot out the ones that I want to push back into the background. So I'm just going to take those two and push them back. And then I think I'll blot out this one. You can only blot while the watercolor is still wet or even damp, but ideally wet. If it's dried up completely, what you have to do is re-wet the leaf from... If your paint has dried up and blotting isn't really doing anything, you can re-wet the whole leaf with clean water and then scrub up with a stiff synthetic brush. I like using my ivory flats. I do have a video all about lifting, so you can check that out if you're not really sure or familiar with the terminology. So I'm going to let those dry, and while they're drying, I might as well make use of our time together. I'll paint in the stems. For that, I will be using my tiny little brush. And what I want to do is just take a little bit of raw sienna. I want to stand by with my tissue. I want to create a little bit of a node in the berries,
And remember that we want these to be pointing in all different directions. So I'm not going to just plop the stem in the center of each one of these. What I want to do is just blot lightly to kind of fade that out a bit. And then before that dries up, I want to go into my burnt umber, grab a little bit on my brush, and then just drop that in. Now the raw sienna is just a tiny bit damp, so the brown will bleed, and that's a good thing. And I'll continue doing that, taking a little bit of raw sienna. I'm going to say for that berry, I'm not going to see a stem. For this berry, I will point it out this way. Here for this one can be in the middle. Now these guys are pretty light, so I don't think they require any blotting. And because I'm not blotting, the paint is going to remain pretty wet. So I won't put the burnt umber into those just yet. I want to give them a chance to dry up a little bit. I'm going to speed things along by just giving it a blast with the hairdryer. All right, I'm going to pop in a little bit of that burnt umber. And now I'm going to take a little bit of violet on my brush. So still working with my number 1, and I'm just going to darken and exaggerate the little knot on the stem. I love the way violet and brown work together. Any shade of brown. I just love the look of those two playing together. They work together so beautifully. I really like the look of the violet, and I think what I'd like to do is, while those stems are drying, go back to creating a bit of a shadow on the leaves. So I'm starting on dry using my ultramarine, and I'm just creating a cast shadow around the leaves, and then I'm going to bleed that out with clean water. So I'm just taking the tip of the brush, putting it up against the ultramarine, and just bleeding it out. To exaggerate that a little bit more, I'm going to drop in a bit of violet around the berries. I'll show you that one more time. Using the ultramarine blue on dry, I cut around the shape of the berry. And if you don't like the harshness of the edge, you just take a little bit of clean water on your brush and just graze the edge of the ultramarine, and it will bleed out beautifully. That might be enough, but if you feel like you want to dull that down a little bit, you're going to grab some of your violet and just drop that into the active blue. So that's wet into wet technique right there. Similarly, I'm just going to take this time a little bit of Hooker's Green Dark on my brush and just cut around that leaf to push it in behind this one. And then bleed that out with a little bit of water. And this time I'm going to drop ultramarine blue instead of the violet. So it's nice to have variety in the foliage. We don't want them having all the same color combinations. Nature isn't like that, so your painting shouldn't be either. Even if this is just a cute little illustration, there should be an element of realism to it or believability. Taking a little bit of Hooker's Green Dark and just cleaning up the edge of this leaf. And I want to give it the illusion of having a little bit of a twist there, so there's a slightly lighter edge. When that's dry, I'll put a shadow underneath. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the berries and I'm going to add a little bit more shadow. Kind of outlining, I hesitate to use the word outlining, but we are kind of outlining the berries. Putting that ultramarine on and then quickly fading out the edge with water. So don't give that blue a chance to dry up. You want to get back to it and bleed it outward or inward, depending on which way your shadow is facing and which berry you want to kind of exaggerate or highlight. I'm going to drop in a little bit of violet. At any point, if you make a boo-boo, you can easily blot, or if anything's too dark, you can blot. This berry's sort of a wonky shape, so I want to take a little bit of ultramarine blue on the larger berries and create the illusion of a bit of a divot where the stem is. So I'm working on dry and then bleeding out. So be mindful that you're not accidentally outlining all your berries. You're just trying to create the illusion of shadow. If you go around every single berry, it's not going to read as shadow. It's going to read as an outline. And that can be pretty, but in this case, I want this to be fairly natural. So I'm going to dry this up, and we have a few little final details to paint on, and then we're finished. So I'm just going to go back to my raw sienna, very, very pale. And I'm just going to encourage a little bit of structure and a little bit of definition on some of the berries. So it's really, really delicate work here. Nothing too obtuse or it's going to look a bit contrived. That just adds a tiny bit more realism. Looking a little too blue. All right, so that's it for the berries. The next step for us is to add the branch and perhaps some veins on the leaves as well. So the branch is super simple. We're just going to be doing one stroke of the burnt umber and then introducing a bit of violet. So most of the branch is obscured by the berries themselves. But the parts that are exposed, I'm going to be putting this line of burnt umber into. Now, what I'd like to do is, before that dries, just take a bit of violet and animate that brown. Again, the violet and the earthiness of the burnt umber are just so juicy and lovely together. So I'm going to let that dry. And then finally, I'm just going to add a little bit of burnt umber to the veins of some of these leaves. And then quickly bleed that out to fade. So I'm kind of scribbling water over the vein just to break it up a little bit. I'm not loving the shape of this berry, so I'm just going to give it a little reconstructive surgery here. Using my ultramarine blue. There we go, it's a little bit better defined. I think I'll use a bit of sap green for the veins on the baby leaves. You don't have to put a center vein at all if you don't want to, or if you feel like it's a bit too much information. The key with creating lovely whimsical illustrations is to keep it super simple. The more complex we make it, the more stiff it looks, and then it loses that playfulness. So here's that shadow I had discussed earlier, just taking a bit of ultramarine blue and just trying to get that edge to turn. I'm going to drop a little bit of violet in, just so it reads as shadow, and then I'm just going to create a really faint little vein running down the middle. Make sure it connects. I think I'd like to see a bit of violet on this one. I'm just going to clean up the edge as well. Earlier I spoke about lifting with your flat brush, and I thought I would show you something. If, as I mentioned, any of the leaves or any parts of the painting are dry and they're feeling a little rigid, or the edges are too sharp, or it's just simply too dark all over, you can take a synthetic brush with just a little bit of water on it and lift that up and then blot with some clean tissue. I figured I might as well show you this. I also would like to just fade the end of the stem out a little bit. So that's how I'm going to do it. So then before we remove the tape, we will dry it up one last time. When it comes time to removing your tape, just make sure that you're pulling out and away. That way you don't accidentally tear into your painting. And there we have it, a pretty little card all set for the holidays. Now you could scan this into a scanner and print off multiple copies of this if you like, or you can hand paint individual ones. I also want to show you how you can create an insert in this card, and that way, if you find it a little challenging to write on the inside of this cold press paper because the texture is a little bit bumpy, it could be a good solution for you. Now, you may find that the cold pressed paper that we've just painted on is a little too rough and porous to be writing on with pen on the inside. So a suggestion would be to just take some typing paper, fold it a little bit smaller, and you can create an insert, which would be, I think, a really pretty finishing touch. You could even consider fastening the insert with a little bit of jute twine, which could be quite pretty as well. It really gives an old-fashioned feel to the card, complete with a craft paper envelope, and your snowberries are ready to be mailed off to friends and family just in time for the holidays. Be sure to check out links to my winter greenery and watercolor, which also might provide you with some inspirational ideas for other holiday cards. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, and if you did, please follow, share, subscribe, leave a comment, or you can even send me a super thanks, which would mean so much to me and would help me immensely in creating more content like this for you. Come follow me on social at 𝒔𝒉𝒂𝒏𝒌.